Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed trauma recovery coach, and I have with us today Laurie Singer. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us. She is a licensed psychotherapist and board-certified behavior analyst who heads the long-established Laurie Singer Behavioral Services in California. Over the last 20 years, she and her team have used uncommon, integrated behavioral and cognitive therapy strategies to help those facing a whole wide variety of mental health issues. Her first book, You're Not Crazy: Living with Anxiety, Obsessions, and Fetishes, brings readers into the therapy room and provides a workbook to help people serve as their own therapist. She is also an accomplished and decorated endurance athlete. She has completed over 100 marathons, many ultra marathons, and Ironman triathlons. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's dive right in because we have a lot to talk about today with neuroscience and all the good stuff behind cognitive behavior therapy. But just tell us a little bit about your journey here, how you landed in this field that you found yourself in.
Well, thank you for having me, Sarah, first of all. And, this was all by chance, really. My life wasn't really planned out. It just kind of took a turn. And you can say that actually it was a traumatic event that got me in the direction that I am right now. So there's different types of trauma, the complex trauma, which goes on over years. And then we have the acute trauma. So there's all these different traumas that take place. And I think, while we're growing up, if you're experiencing that complex trauma, we're not really aware of it. And we develop these coping mechanisms. So that was through my childhood, which my mother was an alcoholic and drug addict, and she left our family when I was very young. So that I never even dealt with until after the acute trauma that happened later in my life. And I call it acute only because it was so short. My son, who passed away of cancer, he got diagnosed and then he died within 2.5 months. So I don't consider that chronic. I consider that more acute because everything happened so fast. And that's really when my life took a turn, I would say, because after his passing, I had decided that I wanted to help the families that we saw suffering in the hospital, but wasn't sure how to do it. And I was such a horrible student. At that time, I wasn't even diagnosed with ADHD until much later in life. So I had all these different things going on in my life. And his death really kind of brought everything together in a way. So I was a runner. I started running after my first daughter was born. And when my son was born, the local junior college had asked me to run cross country, but I was so fearful of going back to school because I was such a horrible student because of the ADHD. So after his passing, he turned 2 years old. He got sick, and then 2.5 months later, he passed away, but he turned 2 within that 2 months and then died shortly after his birthday. It was horrible. It was just an awful, awful thing. And that experience, though, had led me in this direction. And what I did was I did go back to school and run for the team. And I applied my training techniques for training for a race to studying. So on my own, I used some of the same techniques I actually used with clients today who have ADHD, not knowing that I had it. But I knew that I could train for a race, and I did really well. It was like the first thing I was really good at in my life. And so I thought to myself, okay, I've got a plan, like training for a race. I would mark a test that was like in, let's say, 3 weeks. I'd put it on my calendar, and then I would block my schedule. I'm going to study tomorrow for an hour. The next day I'm going to do this and that. So I actually used some of the strategies I'm still using today. So I don't know. I mean, it's a hard question to answer, but it got me where I wanted to help people. It then led into another direction. I never thought I would work with individuals with developmental disabilities. But I have to say that, thinking back, when my son was very sick and he actually, the tumor crushed his spine and he went paralyzed. So as I was pushing him in the wheelchair around the hospital outside to get him some fresh air, nobody would look at us and nobody wanted to make eye contact because they were, you see somebody with a disability and now it's different. Back then people would look the other way or people don't know what to say. So they just don't say anything. And it makes me feel horrible. Like, nobody's going to say hi to my son because he's in a wheelchair. So I remember that feeling and that feeling went with me. And I just love this population that I work with. So I not only work with individuals with intellectual disabilities, but then other people started coming, people with anxieties, with phobias. And so everything just kind of grew.
Wow, that's wild. Unbelievable, though, that your story came from where so many stories come from hurt and this pain, and then wanting something beautiful to kind of grow out of it. And here you've been now for the last couple of decades working with this newer population in this kind of brain retraining, cognitive and behavioral therapy. So let's into that. Let's talk about so it's called CBT, right? Cognitive behavior therapy. With CBT, this is people with anxiety, phobias, OCD is one that's fetishes, things like that, right? So what does that actually look like when someone's coming in? Just tell us a little bit more about what CBT actually is.
Okay, and before I do that, just real quickly, I just want to let you know that a lot of clients that come in, they come in because they're debilitated, right? Something's happening in their life, whether it's a relationship or their work or their school, or even with self-injurious behavior, so it's exhibited through this OCD or anxiety behavior. But typically there's a cause to it, and the cause could be from something traumatic. More than likely it is, it's caused by a traumatic event that the individual is not even aware of to begin with. So when they come to see me, it could be, for example, for skin picking, right? And skin picking, with that, I mean, like, severe skin picking where the flesh is ripped or the face is disfigured, and they're referred to by a physician. So then comes into my office and we start to go back in a timeline. Well, when did this first start? Well, I really haven't picked in 10 years. Oh, 10 years ago it started. Tell me what happened 10 years ago around the time that it began. So it is important to find out what that traumatic event was, but we don't have to stay there forever. We find out what the cause of it was because they came up with some coping mechanisms that seemed to work for a while. Maybe it was just that they would scratch their legs, excuse me, initially, but then maybe that turned into deep picking because it wasn't gratifying enough or relieving the anxiety that was caused by this traumatic experience.
Yeah.
So cognitive behavioral therapy. I use cognitive behavioral therapy along with behavioral therapy because I think it's a great combination. And the reason why is I'll tell you. So cognitive behavioral therapy is those negative thoughts, those anxiety producing thoughts trigger emotions, and those emotions are acted out through our behavior. So that behavior can be thinking you're having a heart attack, panic attacks. It could be skin picking. It could be avoidant behavior. Maybe something happened at work between a colleague, and now you're concerned that you're going to run into that colleague because those same feelings of shame or whatever it is that you're experiencing will come back again. So you start to call in sick. Then you take too many days off. Now you're laid off from work. That's just an example. Yeah. So how do we get you to change those negative thoughts? That's the cognitive part. The behavioral aspect of it is what part of your behavior is contributing to your maladaptive behaviors you're exhibiting. You're not going to work, for example. So let's look at the environment as a whole. Is your spouse, is your sibling, is somebody saying, oh, I'm so sorry. Are they enabling you in some way? Let me call your office today. Let me do this for you today. Don't worry about going to work. So then we have somebody who hasn't worked in 6 months or a year because their partner has kind of made this environment for them where they don't have to. And I just want to say too, that the longer you engage in a maladaptive behavior, whether it's avoidance, whether it's skin picking, whether it's drinking excessively or using drugs, the harder it is to stop. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it'll just be harder.
Yeah. Yeah, because some of those behaviors then become habits, right?
That
So
is correct.
when you're starting working with the thinking behavior, the cognitive side of it, sometimes is there these actual behavioral like addictions, then you have to kind of hit into those. Now you're doing it even without the thoughts. You're doing it just because it's a habitual thing that your body is used to doing. Is
Sure.
that
Yeah.
where like the behavioral therapy also comes in?
Right. And well, and somebody comes to my office, what it looks like is they come in and some of them want to be there, some of them don't want to be there. And there's that part of it as well. Well, my partner says I have to come in because we'll use the work one, for example. It's time for me to go back to work. I'm not contributing anymore. And she's worried about me staying home, and now it's affected my overall health. I've gained 30 pounds. I'm not going out of the house now. What started as not going to work has now, okay, I'm afraid to leave the house. I'm afraid to do this, or I don't want to socialize. So I like to meet, it depends. Like sometimes I'll meet with the family as a whole first, and sometimes I'll just meet with the client first and then bring the family in, because each one is contributing in their own way. They just don't realize it yet. And what I do is I give out data sheets, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And these data sheets are very important because they describe coming from you. First of all, what was the behavior? I stayed home from work. What happened just before that? What were you doing or thinking? I was thinking, I don't want to run into that person again because I'm afraid that she's going to say something negative to me. Right. And what was the consequence? My wife called in for me and said, and sick for me that day. So get that information. And then the data sheet would be given to the spouse or the parent or the sibling, whoever it is, and it would be from their perspective. What did they see? So what was the behavior you saw? I saw Sarah pacing back and forth in the room. I saw her talking to herself negatively. What happened just before that? She was getting ready for work. And what was the consequence of that? I called in sick for Sarah. Yeah. So all that information is extremely important. Yeah. And so then when they come back a week later and we would analyze the data together, well, analyzing the data, we go into more detail with the behavior that way and with your thoughts. So it might be one more week of data collection. And then from that data collection, I write a treatment plan. Mm-hmm. And that treatment plan, what it looks like is a motivational story. It's just for you. And it would be something like, my name is Sarah. I have something called anxiety, but that does not define who I am. Mm-hmm. I've decided to move forward in my life. It's really, it's important that I learn how to change my thoughts so that I can change my behavior. And it goes into more detail depending on what you've written in your data sheets. It's based on that story.
Wow. So it's really shifting the narrative of
Correct.
your overall, like this has to do a lot with like self-perception, I'm hearing, right? And how you view yourself, which as we know, trauma really skews a lot of that, right? Especially if it was narcissistic abuse or childhood complex PTSD, where, there's a parent who's basically making you feel like you're not worthy, or there's a lot of shame or guilt that you're holding. Does that play into it when someone is really stuck and not really sure what their worth is, or they don't have a lot of self-love, how are they able to move forward in changing the overarching story and narrative about who they are?
So along with that narrative story, that I call it a motivational story, along with that are specific strategies that they have to practice. Okay. And for example, I put something called the signal plan, and I used it when I was in therapy because all of a sudden I never dealt with my childhood situation. I never really dealt with my son's situation because I jumped right into going to school. And so then in graduate school, they had said, hey, if you go to therapy for 10 hours, you can get 100 hours worth of your clinical hours that you have to collect. And I had to get 3,000 hours. So I said, oh, sign me up. So when I went to therapy, and she pointed out, your childhood really wasn't a typical childhood. And, you need to deal with your son. Well, then I started having panic attacks and I couldn't drive on the freeway. So she was giving me typical CBT therapist will tell you, okay, so I want you to do breathing, deep breathing, but they weren't telling me to practice my breathing, and I didn't have any visuals. So I would think to myself, okay, let's see, red means stop. So whenever I get a negative thought, I'm going to stop whatever I'm thinking. Yellow means make a choice. So when you're at a signal, you have to make a choice to either go through the light or stop. I'm going to make a choice to move forward with my life. I'm going to think about something positive. I'm going to therapy now. I know I can do this. And green means go. So now I'll start my deep breathing. So I make visuals, and that visual really helped me because I made a little signal card out of shot glasses. Now everything's online digital, but back in the old days, I had to draw it, and, and I would take it with me. And I thought, this is really effective. I mean, you can have a visual that reminds you to use your strategies. And I also have for my clients, I also do a schedule. So they have to read their story in the morning, then they have to practice their breathing throughout the day, because it's not enough for a therapist to say, when you get this feeling, I want you to breathe. I want you to think of this. Well, that's like, say you're going to sign up for a half marathon, but you don't run, and then you show up on race day. So, how does that work? You need to practice those strategies before an event so that you're ready, you feel prepared. So changing that self-narrative, you can tell yourself, which will be in the story, I'm working on myself now. I'm going to move forward with my life. I can do this. I know I can. I have other people to help me. The other people will be aware of the signal plan. So let's say your spouse sees you starting to pace, because we know now that once you pace, that's an indicator of you feeling anxiety. So your husband or spouse or friend or whatever will say, Sarah, red, you need to stop. Yellow, make a choice. Sarah, let's breathe. And then you breathe together. So everybody's helping you along the way.
I like the flipping of the roles of even the family members as well, too, because it's not just, we don't just really change in a vacuum, right? In our own little bubble. It really takes that community, because there usually was someone also helping with enabling, or at least, oh, it's okay to be afraid of that, is somehow kind of perpetuating it a little bit, or at least validating it, which I think that there's room for that, but on a regular basis, it ends up to be more enabling to the behavior. So I'm curious with like brain structure, actual cognitive things, ADD, ADHD, OCD, maybe phobias that were passed down from generations. How does genetics play into this with some of these more classic disorders?
It's huge, huge. It really is. I think, honestly, I look back at my mom must have had ADHD. I know she did. And she, and I see that's where my brother and I have that. And we have that impulsivity part in it as well, my brother and I. But luckily, I was able to get into athletics, because if I had not, and I've been with my husband since I was 19 years old. So I think that was a great choice in my life, because it gave me stability, for the first time. And his parents just welcomed me with open arms. So now I had this family, which was great, And so my husband, and then my athleticism, if I had not, that was the first time in my life I was good at something, so it was, and then it was hard for me to believe that I was actually good at it. But I could have easily taken a path with the drugs and alcohol like my mom did, because she didn't have that in her life. So I see it in my brother, and come in my office. I mean, it's like, oh, well,
you kind of see where it came from.
Yeah. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree typically, or it could skip a generation. And I just think it's understanding. Once people get that diagnosis, they're like, oh, thank goodness, that's what's going on with me. And and then you can normalize it, and you can say, look, there's other people that are like you. And it could actually be used as a strength. I mean, how many professionals do you know that have OCD? I would say 9 out of 10, honestly, because they're driven in that direction. But at the same time, it's a blessing and a curse, because we still have to learn how to balance. And so we count on others for that. Otherwise, we'll just run ourselves into the ground.
Yeah, yeah. I do hear that the practice of CBT, and I know there's a real kind of systematic approach to it, right? Like you were saying with the practicing, right? Making sure that you're continuing to practice so that you're ready when the marathon does come, you know? So it's
Yes.
a constant retraining of the brain. So I'm curious, when there's genetics involved, this might be the type of brain, OCD, ADHD, you know, somewhere with like a processing kind of disorder, this might be the only brain that they've ever known. And it does have a lot of plus sides. So, what would you say to someone who's maybe going, I don't know if I really want to change how I think or act because it has taken me to this space? Like, is CBT going to actually change your thoughts, your beliefs? Is it actually moving those neural pathways, or is it reorganizing them, restructuring them? Like, what is that actually?
Well, I
Yeah.
can speak from my own personal experience and how I've helped other people. It really, usually people with ADHD, their life is a mess, honestly. You know, even in school, well, I can use myself as an example. And then people that come to see me, I was a horrible student. I was so ashamed of my spelling, my writing. I was always getting sent to the principal's office because my attention span is just so short. I could just, you know, my mind would just fill with everything else. So I think that when a person with ADHD is given structure and find out what works for them, taking breaks in between, you know, like, okay, what is your time? How long can you work for? Can you work for 30 minutes and be productive? Okay, let's set a timer for 30 minutes. You're going to work on this project, then you're going to take a 10-minute break. You're going to fold laundry or go outside and just get a breath of fresh air, you know, do some dishes, then come back and sit down again. And it's, you know, these work. Or if it's a child, let's do a sensory break. What does that mean? You know, let's go outside and jump on the trampoline, or let's go outside and do 15 jumping jacks. Then we're going to come back inside, because these types of break just gets the brain to refocus. And when people see that, when they feel that sense of accomplishment, it rises their self-esteem. They feel better about themselves, and they're going to continue to follow that path.
Yeah, yeah, it gives that momentum of those spins. Yeah, I love that. Laurie, this has been so helpful and informative. I want to give you a minute to get into your book. So your new book that just came out is called "You're Not Crazy: Living with Anxiety, Obsessions, and Fetishes." So this is supposed to act kind of as like almost a workbook for people to do their own therapy work. So tell us a little bit about the book. Who should be reading this book?
Well, the book was written, one reason, well, a couple of reasons. One was because I had some clinicians in the area, dermatologists and other psychologists, that would refer to me, and they said, Laurie, you know, your therapy really works, combining these two therapies together, actually giving the clients a notebook with a treatment plan that they can use. You should really write a book. And so finally I thought, okay, you know, I said, I've reached a certain age. I'm a goal setter. So I said, I'm going to write this book. And what I did was I organized it in a way where I thought, should I share some of myself? I think I will, you know, some of the parts, like how can this therapist know about anxiety, or how has she experienced it? So I did get into my, you know, my bit and trying to explain where this all started. And then I took 6 case studies. And those case studies, some of the hardest ones that I got, I put those in the book and changed the name so they don't know who they are. But one quick thing too, when you were saying earlier, you said that family contributes and they may not know what they're doing, and first they think it's the right thing. I don't know how many times I can tell you that parents or spouses have said, thank you for giving me something to do, because I didn't know what to do. I feel like I'm doing the wrong thing, but I don't know what to do. Now you're giving me something concrete. Every time they engage in this behavior, this is what I need to do.
Yeah.
So it's very helpful that way. So the 6 studies are some of the hardest cases I've ever had. And it walks you through that. And it's interesting because most of the people that come to see me, they think they're the worst case. So by reading this, they'll say, oh my gosh, you know, misery loves company. I'm not the worst case. Clearly, you know, look at this person or that person. And with each of those, we might identify just a piece of it, you know, not the whole thing, but say, oh, you know what, that happened to me, or I feel this way sometimes. So the case studies talks about what it looks like when you come into my office, the data sheets, how, you know, what stories were given, what type of therapy was given in that notebook. And then at the end of the book, it gives you, the toolkit is in the back. It's how to write your own motivational story. It gives you the actual data sheets. It gives you the signals, so you can print everything out, or you can look for it online. It kind of tells you, okay, if you want the signal card, this is what you should probably do online, or you can use whatever's in the book. And that's it. I think it normalize what you're going through. It helps you to write your own plan if you want to. I've also had people reach out to me who are family members, and then, not the person themselves that experiencing the anxiety, but living with the situation.
Love that they're also included in this, because there is work to be done for people who are living with people who are struggling. And it is true that, just like trauma does not discriminate, cognitive disorders and the way our brain functions, everyone has some kind of something, everyone, even a learning style differs from person to person, right? And so it just depends on how it is affecting you negatively in your life. And if you're feeling in that debilitating place, these seem like some really, really great tools. So I love that. We're going to have the book linked up in the show notes below. Before I let you go, though, I always like to ask everyone, what were you listed a couple, because obviously you started in therapy, and obviously being an athlete were really helpful. What was some of the resources for you when you've been on your healing journey in the grief process and your childhood experiences?
I think really the best book that I read for myself after my son passed away is When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And that was a book written by a rabbi whose son passed away at the age of 10. He had this very strange illness. And by the time he was chronologically 10 years old, he really had the body of an 80-year-old man. And so he passed away of old age at 10. And this was a man who was questioning God because he could see the suffering that took place. And that's what I went through a lot with, our being sick, was in the hospital, and we were on a floor that just was full of children that were sick. And how could this be God's plan? How could he let children suffer like this? And so that was a big question for me. And the book helped me because it said, when your son or your child passes away, try to do something to memorialize them in some way. And so what my husband and I did, since I'm a runner, I said, let's just have a fun run. This was a few months after he passed away, and people wanted to do so much for us, and they didn't know what to do. What can you do, And so I had a fun run at our house. And this year will be the, I believe, 38th annual fun run in our son's name. And all the money is donated to Children's Hospital, but it's donated to buy the kids. Well, it used to be to buy the kids toys. Now, actually, from our event, Children's Hospital contacted us 10 years into the event. So it was like 28 years ago, and said, hey, we're getting a lot of checks coming in your son's name. Would you like to develop a child life program? And then all the money will go to the Child Life program. So we were actually the founders of that program, where other people hopped on board, and I'm sure have given a lot more money. But still, that program on the cancer floor is a no doctor zone. It has therapists in there that help the children who are sick and dying. It helps the siblings of the children to help them come to terms with everything. It's entire playroom at Children's Hospital.
Oh my goodness, that is beautiful. Oh, I love that. That is amazing. 38th annual coming up. I love that. What a great way, to put something that you already know that you love, you're running, right? And mixing it with this beautiful way to memorialize him. And I love that you continue to do it year after year. That is really, really beautiful. Oh, goodness. Oh, Laurie Singer, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story and all of these great tools with us today. Please tell people where they can find you. All of this and your book all linked up below for people to reach out to you.
Sure. If anybody wants to contact me, you can look at my website, lauriesingerbehavioral.com, or you'renotcrazybook.com. And I'd be happy to, and people can email me and I'll email them back.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Keep up the amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.